People who were working on the discovery of the neutron, I doubt they were sort of thinking about the incineration of Hiroshima at that time, even though it occurred only 13 years later, just a tiny, tiny sort of gap from these people just playing with systems in their lab to this absolutely immense destruction. AI and AGI are going to result in a large number of just extraordinary things. I am the beneficiary of one of the very first drugs that was done using protein design, and very sympathetic to people who are just excited for that sort of positive upside. But there's the possibility of an enormous negative downside. I think at first I rolled my eyes a bit. I would see the Pope commenting or the United Nations commenting, and that was just completely wrong. It's important that all those people are thinking about this, and solutions will come from very different and maybe unexpected directions.
Michael, welcome to the Future of Life Institute podcast.
Thanks for having me, Gus.
You've written a series of wonderful, insightful essays on AI risk. And one point you make here is that deeply understanding reality is intrinsically dual use. What does that mean, and what are some examples of that?
I suppose I just mean that if certainly, to some extent, I'm speaking of an empirical fact. If you look back through millennia, whenever we've had sufficiently deep understanding of reality, it's always created opportunities to change reality in ways that give us power, and that it can have both constructive and destructive uses. A relatively recent example in the scheme of human history is something like the discovery of subatomic physics and quantum physics in the early part of the 20th century. And this led to many, many wonderful things, a lot of modern material science, the semiconductor industry, and much of the modern economy. It was also led in part to nuclear weapons and thermonuclear weapons. And it's very difficult to see how you could get one without also getting the other. I can't prove that this is always the case, but certainly looking historically at many examples, if you go back further and you think about Newtonian mechanics and things like that, and sort of the way that plugs into artillery calculations and things like that, it's kind of another example to some extent.
And this is the core of the problem of AI risk, in your opinion, right? It's about the fact that when we understand, or when we create systems that can understand reality at a deeper level, that then confers power to these systems in ways that can be both good or bad.
Yeah, in fact, it's not even AI risk. It's a broader thing, which is risk created by science and technology. There's this wonderful paper from, I think it's 1955, by John von Neumann, which really mirrors a lot of discussion of AI risk. Other people like Oppenheimer wrote similar things, although not quite as broad. And it's just, as human beings attain this very deep understanding, our ability to do things like modify the weather starts to increase, or modify the climate starts to increase. So, yeah.
This is a different framing than thinking of AI risk in terms of alignment. You are quite concerned that it will be easier to create a truth-seeking system than an aligned system. Why would that be easier?
I don't mean, well, easier. I'm not sure that's quite where I would focus. Certainly the point is that, whenever you have the notion of alignment, famously people will reply aligned to what? And the historic answer, we've been solving the alignment problem as a society and as a civilization for millennia. You go back to the Code of Hammurabi and people like that, and we're trying to attain this kind of social consensus, and then the institutions necessary to implement that social consensus, however imperfectly. Obviously, civilization is not perfect. Bad things still happen, but we've achieved a pretty good degree of alignment with some consensus notion. That the issue becomes, a very significant issue, is when it is possible for people to unilaterally defect, sort of locally. If tremendous power is available to them, they can violate it, this social consensus. It's also just the sheer fact that different groups will converge on different consensuses. So the United States military, the Russian military, the Chinese military are unlikely to have the same standards of alignment as, say, consumer apps in the United States. And consumer apps in the United States are going to have very different notions than, say, applications in China. When DeepSeek released their model, quite a number of people at least informally reported. I don't know whether I didn't see any sort of formal evaluation, but they informally reported that a lot of things that the CCP doesn't particularly like appeared to be censored in the model. So, there's a significant difference in the alignment just along that axis.
Why is it that we can't solve AI risk by simply doing what we've been doing with other risky technologies, which is adapt as we go? Something happens, there's a catastrophe, we implement new regulation, and we can kind of we can co-evolve with this technology. Why would advanced AI be different?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's kind of the quadrillion-dollar question, and maybe it turns out that we can. It remains to be seen. There's a certain amount of sort of optimism there. If you think historically about sort of previous technologies, particularly previous sort of major platform technologies, very often this works incredibly well. An example I love is the introduction of jet engines. And actually, one of the very first companies to work on this, Comet, had, I think it was 3, maybe 4 fatal crashes in their first year of operation. And of course, they shut down. But by the same token, while that's a terrible human loss, it created an enormous incentive for the other companies to get it right and really improve the technology a lot. So, not just capitalism, but in fact, just plain consumer sentiment and whatnot often does a really good job of doing this kind of alignment. A very large number of technologies that works remarkably well. Just sort of word of mouth, it's kind of, it's sufficient to exert a lot of pressure on the people doing it. It's not perfect. You still get snake oil being sold. You sometimes get terrible things being sold. Underground economies often have big problems with this. The things like drugs, which actually cause deaths. There's no legal recourse there, and it's very difficult to communicate, sort of in a public way. You can't say this supplier is bad, on Twitter. You're opening yourself up to kind of all kinds of problems. So sort of the signaling doesn't work there. Now, if you think about problems like nuclear weapons or climate change or chlorofluorocarbons back in the 70s and 80s, those kinds of things, all instances where the traditional institutions have at best struggled for a variety of reasons. Climate is, I think, a very interesting one in particular. You've just got this situation where you've got this enormous kind of engine of capital, which has a strong interest in continuing to perpetuate this situation. And they don't particularly want to switch away. They're not experts on renewable energy or things like that. So the question becomes, what does AI risk or ASI X risk, what character does it have? How do you classify it there? And I suppose at least my intuition, my belief is that this ability to put enormously dangerous capabilities in the hands of individuals makes it much more similar to the case of something like climate or sort of democratized nukes than it is to a conventional technology.
There is also the framing of AI or ASI as a generator of new technologies that could potentially be dangerous. And then perhaps talk about this framing of AI as a generator of new technologies in a world that is potentially vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious example that's sort of it's a progenitor, it's a prototype for what we're going to see. AlphaFold, solved sort of the protein structure prediction. If you can predict structures pretty well, that's actually enormously helpful for doing design work. You say, here's the design I want. And, sort of the way the generative models tend to work is they try lots of slight variations. They keep running the predictor and seeing how well it works. So we've had a big iteration in the last few years on our ability to do antibody design and things like that. At this point, my understanding, and I'm not an expert, is that we're kind of in an intermediate state there. There's not a whole lot of new drugs have hit the market. There's not a whole lot of these kinds of things which have hit the market, but it's getting close. It's really interesting just to look at the literature, and you can see these people who are interested in protein design, they just go absolutely kind of bananas after AlphaFold. I can't remember who it was. Somebody pointed out to me, like, the job listings at one of the companies that does this. It was all for Python programmers and people who are expert in PyTorch and things like this, that kind of thing. But it's still early days. But then you start to think about things like prion design, which is 2 words that ought to strike terror into anybody's hearts. And then, the question of why it was protein design and not virus design that was kind of done first is an interesting one. My understanding is just there wasn't as much sort of data collected about viruses. You had the protein data bank, which was this enormous, very well curated service, and you had sort of just less good data, partially due to historic accident, is my impression as a non-expert. But that, again, sort of thinking, probably not that far away from being able to do high quality virus design, and that's going to have many, many, many wonderful impacts. But it's also something that you don't necessarily want in the hands of individuals unstable. I think in the early days, it is going to be a specialist. It's clearly going to be a specialist technology, which will require a considerable amount of background to use and deploy. Over time, access to that will become increasingly democratized. Maybe take a step back. You asked about the vulnerable world. And that is just the question of whether or not there are, relatively simple, easy to deploy, easy to make and deploy technologies which can cause catastrophic or existential risk to humanity. And this sounds, I think, implausible to most people, sort of a priori. But then when you start to look at actual kind of examples from even the history of life on Earth, and it's maybe not so ridiculous. People, very, very well-informed people were extremely skeptical that nuclear weapons would work. You go back much, billions of years in time, there's things like the Great Oxygenation Event, where the ability to metabolize into oxygen actually, wiped out probably most species on Earth. And there are many examples one can give along the way, which show that very simple but completely transformative technologies are possible. And you have to ask the question, are we close to being able to do that again? Any tool which is capable of significantly advancing science and technology can potentially plug in and help enable that.
And then that, I think, naturally leads to the question of whether our institutions can keep up with the pace of development of these new ways to affect the world that could be potentially dangerous. How do we know whether we're on the right path here?
Well, I mean, to some extent, of course, the funny and ironic thing about this is that small scale disasters are very helpful for improving institutions. Certainly, I think things like, if you look at things like, say, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the various test ban treaties, the infrastructure, when I say infrastructure, I mean sort of almost the social infrastructure that was necessary to create those, that all gets reused to some extent. Even an example I love is the Vienna and the Montreal protocols, which resulted in the banning of CFCs. One of the things which is interesting about those is that every state in the world signed it, and that had never been done before. And so you have this sort of interesting situation where it's like, oh, it's possible for everybody to agree and to just blanket replace technology. So I think those kinds of things represent really significant institutional progress. Unfortunately, they're not always, they're quite bespoke. They're not, it's not that we've got something that's kind of, helping those things directly scale up. Something that I think is valuable about podcasts like this, in terms like existential risk and things like that, they do start to create kind of common norms and just a common language which people can use to communicate about this. And that's obviously incredibly valuable at the, it starts to make it easier to coordinate.
How concerned should we be about losing control to advanced AI? Is that perhaps the right framing here?
I mean, I think that's a very significant issue. It's one of many possible risks. But I mean, your listeners will have heard many people talk about this before, and it's probably the most prominent of all the ASI X risk scenarios. So my personal opinion, yes, I'm very concerned about that. I don't think it's kind of the fundamental issue. I'm just more concerned in general with this possibility for destructive technologies. It would be an example of such a destructive technology. It is not necessarily the only.
Which direction are the incentives here, the market incentives? Which directions are they pushing in? Because on the one hand, you can see that it's not useful to put a product out there that's dangerous, right? It's not profitable in the long run to deploy dangerous products. On the other hand, it seems like we are racing the companies, countries, and so on towards developing advanced AI systems at a very fast pace, and perhaps without thinking long and hard about the consequences.
It's not even just the question of profitable. There's also just the fact that it's people running these companies, and they don't want to die. They don't want their children to die. So that's kind of, for for many of those people, that's an even more significant thing than concerns about, will I get some nice stock options? To return to the quantum mechanics and the nuclear physics example, though, the people who were working on the discovery of the neutron were not, I believe anyway, I doubt they were sort of thinking about the incineration of Hiroshima at that time, even though it occurred only, I think it was 13 years later. Just a tiny, tiny sort of gap from these people just playing with systems in their lab to this absolutely immense destruction. And yet, from the point of view of the people who were discovering things like the neutron and the proton and the structure of the nucleus and so on, that just seemed like a wonderful game with enormous benefits to humanity. In fact, it did have enormous benefits to humanity. That's part of what is really difficult, of course, about the situation. AI and AGI are going to result in a large number of just extraordinary things. I suffer from a mild chronic lifelong condition. I am the beneficiary of one of the very first drugs that was done using protein design. It's a previous iteration. It wasn't done with what we would today call an AI system. But boy, do I ever think this is a great thing at some level? And I'm so excited for other people to kind of get access to those kinds of things as well, and very sympathetic to people who are just excited for that sort of positive upside. But there's the possibility of a very hard to defend an enormous negative downside.
How do we recognize which world we're in then? If the bad world in which there's a huge downside looks like the good world in which we get a bunch of upside from AI and we avoid the risk, this is one of the things that makes this debate quite difficult, or makes this arguing about AI risk difficult, because how do we distinguish between these worlds?
It is difficult. Actually, I'm speaking a little through my hat here. I'm not quite sure, but if you think about, as I say, sort of circa 1930, people had started to consider the possibility of nuclear-like weapons about that time. It was still very speculative, but I think it was probably very unclear just how, are we going to get things which can wipe out a city block, a city, a country, and so there's kind of some unknown level of destruction. And so if you're sort of thinking, oh, maybe some of this work that I'm doing on understanding subatomic physics might one day be used in this destructive way, it's just this sort of enormous range of possible negative outcomes that I think they probably needed to wait. But sort of the E equals MC squared gives you some bounds on the size of it. It turns out, I think thermonuclear bombs, they're something like 0.7% efficient or something. And at some level, the question of sort of cost per megaton becomes the relevant one there. And I don't think it was at all apparent what that cost was going to be for a long time. So that's the analog, I suppose, of your question. I wanted to put it in that sort of concrete context to just make it clear that actually a very, it wouldn't surprise me at all if at that time in history, it could have ranged over 5, 6, 7 orders of magnitude, sort of a plausible estimate. So that's a problem. I'm not sure I've addressed part of your question. I don't think I've addressed all of it, fortunately.
Perhaps one thing to ask here is alignment, and the question of whether focusing on alignment is the right approach. You describe what you call the alignment dilemma. Could you describe what that is?
Actually, an analogy I've come to like recently is imagining you're an Olympic swimmer. You directly identify that if you want to be an outstanding sprinter, if you want to win yourself a gold medal, you need to work on your strength. In fact, you need to work very, very hard on your strength. But if all you do is work on your strength, that's actually going to be quite counterproductive. You are not going to be a good swimmer. So you need to sort of work on that, but in the sort of the larger context. I think it's very clear that a major impact of the work on alignment, which has been done so far, has just been to speed up the creation of these systems. Certainly, I think in particular the invention and successful use of RLHF, really turned chatbots to some extent, and not just RLHF, but other things as well. But that was very important. Turned chatbots from being sort of interesting systems into things which are very friendly, but you can make them much more friendly to consumers. You can make them much more friendly to governments. And so that's a sort of a way of really speeding up the capitalist race that you referenced before. So, is that, it helps you with one set of important goals, which is indeed, making your AI system relatively controllable and so on, but at the expense of causing tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars to come pouring into space and really accelerating everything. So it's not clear to me. To me, that seems maybe a little bit like having gone absolutely nuts on a certain type of strength training program while trying to basically slowing, really damaging your ability to swim. You're not actually solving the problem.
What would actually solve the problem then? What is the alternative that a person that could be working on alignment should be working on?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose I'm just pretty negative actually on most of the work on alignment. Anything which is focused purely on the properties of the individual systems, I think the tendency is just for that to align with the interests of the companies. The things that I am more interested in and think are much more promising, it's all external. It's all sort of governance in the rest of the world. So people who are interested in questions like how to do real-time sort of monitoring of biological threats and sort of response models there, computer security, these kinds of things. Safety isn't a property of a system. Safety is a property of the system and its complete environment. And in fact, very often that it's really working on the environment which matters much more. At the moment, the people who can work on safety of the systems, those systems are controlled by the companies. The natural effect is all of that work will be aligned with the interests of the companies. It's not perfect, of course, because they're large entities and it's very hard to get that alignment perfect. But I think generally speaking, that's it's basically it's most work on the alignment of individual systems is serving the needs of capital. If you're thinking about sort of the alignment problem for society in general, if you're ensuring the flourishing human civilization, the kind of thing FLI is dedicated to, that's, now you're talking about people who are working on these, I think, sort of much broader problems. Even I mentioned things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and things like that. That's sort of a long line of work that is aimed at creating this kind of collective safety.
Do you think it matters whether the companies are aiming at creating agentic systems or whether they're aiming to create better and better AIs that remain tools?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can flip the question around a bit and sort of ask what's in capital's interest. And I think there it's quite clear, there's an enormous interest in making them agentic, even just for very simple kind of reasons. People are going to love sort of friendship and romance bots, and it's better. They're going to be more interesting and more attractive if they're somewhat more agentic. They can buy you flowers. They can do these kinds of things. Even that sort of very simple kind of thing. Over time, there's something of a slippery slide. I mean, famously, there have been quite a number now of flash crashes. They're often a little bit obscure what's going on, but some kind of AI-like or sort of early machine learning type or data science type system, which is hooked up to the markets, in many cases, seems to be causing some kind of massive change in the market. Sometimes, sort of $1 trillion kind of a fluctuation. Is that agentic in the full human sense? No, but it's a system that has to some degree kind of goals and rewards, and is capable of taking not just a little bit of action in the world, but potentially being responsible for the movement of hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. And those examples go back, let's see, I mean, certainly 15 years. There was a flash crash in 2010. So I think it's very hard to see a situation where they remain merely tools, whatever that is. I mean, it's not even clear. Like, what's the criterion by which something is just a tool versus something which is, it's the difference between an amanuensis and a composer at some level. Actually, those two things are not so distinct.
How did you come to be convinced that there's actually something to be concerned about with AI risk?
Yeah, I think mostly. So in the late 1980s, I read a bunch of writing by Carl Sagan and some of his friends about nuclear risk. A lot of people now view some of that as being naive or wrong. I also read Eric Drexler's book, Engines of Creation, where he talked about grey goo and sort of scenarios like that. There's a lot of technical problems with some of that work, but it got me sort of interested and aware. It also seemed, I mean, he's quite upfront about sort of the technical problems at some level there. And then later on, I became a theoretical physicist. I worked for a very long time on quantum computing, and it just became clear, oh, yeah, the world actually has, this enormous latent power inside it. Our current technologies seem to me just to be merely scratching the surface.
You gotta explain that. I think what does latent power mean? Is this something that you understand when you understand a discipline deeply, when you become a physicist or a biologist or something?
It's funny, I'm not super expert on something like nuclear fission, but I kind of understand it well enough. It's a little bit shocking. You kind of go through and you realize, oh wow, this is actually really quite simple, and it's just hidden. It is not obvious at all that it's out there in the world, and it's a good thing for us. It's sort of rather fortunate for us that it's not a little bit easier to make these bombs, and it's not a little bit easier to make them much larger. Those are due to sort of somewhat contingent random facts about the world. Because that experience, I guess, over and over, I worked on things like quantum teleportation and quantum algorithms and things like that. And again, you just have this experience of, you know, people wrote down, these very simple sort of models of the world, and there's all these things hidden inside them that you don't realize. Science is just so full of that. Actually, public key cryptography is, I think, a wonderful example. It's a miracle. It could have been invented, I think, I mean, certainly many hundreds of years ago. Just these incredible ideas hidden essentially inside number theory.
A recent example of latent power hidden in biology might be something like mirror life. Again, of course, I'm not an expert here, but it seems to me plausible that mirror life is an actual threat. And this is something that you wouldn't be. This is something that you wouldn't have been able to guess if you're not a biologist, kind of with deep understanding here.
I think that's right. It is a good example. I mean, it's by no means clear that it is actually an enormous threat, but I'm not particularly keen to find out either. It's just that's playing with fire. Actually, fire is. I mean, the Promethean example is it's such a good example. It is. Sometimes people will say, oh, these sort of vulnerable world recipes for ruin. That seems so implausible. And then you say, well, can you take a simple technology which you can buy for well under $1? Anybody can operate, anybody can get it anywhere in the world, and with no extra input, have it cause $1 billion of damage and 1,000 deaths. And of course, the answer is yes. You just need a match, and it's a good thing. Imagine if you increase the oxygen content of the air just a little, fires would become much more fierce. It'd be much easier to establish a firestorm. There's anthropic reasons why this doesn't happen. We live in a pretty friendly world, because if we didn't live in a pretty friendly world, we wouldn't have survived to this point. Unfortunately, now we have these enormous brains and all these wonderful ways of deepening our understanding of the world, and it's by no means clear that we're going to remain in that relatively friendly regime.
It's a pretty deep question, actually, whether we live in a friendly world or not, whether the world is vulnerable. What evidence do you think we have so far about this? Is the way that the world works, as we understand it scientifically, favorable to our existence? Is one way of asking the question.
I don't know how to attack the broad question, except in the very negative way, where you could, in fact, demonstrate, oh, here's a particular lethal technology. Actually, it's a problem with discussions of ASI X risk. I've had many conversations with sincere, thoughtful leaders in technology who are like, I kind of see why people are concerned, but like, these AI doomers, they always get quite vague when I ask them to connect the dots in the scenarios. So like, well, I'm not sure actually how much we should want the dots connected. I get the feeling some of them are not going to be satisfied with anything other than a detailed description of a recipe, which might be intellectually satisfying, but also seems like a dreadful mistake to to make.
This is one of your persuasion paradoxes, where if you make a highly persuasive a detailed case of how AI could be risky, you're then putting dangerous information out there. And this is something that hinders the debate from moving forward.
Yeah, I think it hinders it somewhat. Honestly, at this point, I don't think it hinders it that much. Although it is by its very nature quite difficult to know. I hear dark whispers from people that, there are rumors that a model was used to do such and such. It's maybe a fun thing to hint at. I suspect very often the reality is less interesting than the kind of the gossip for now.
Perhaps that's a key point here when you say for now, because if skepticism about AI risk is skepticism about how intelligent current systems are, then you can experience tells us that you can probably wait a year or 5 years, and then you will have more advanced systems and you will at some point face the issues.
Well, there's that. And you also, you just have to wonder as well, like that there's some gap between what is being done publicly and what is being done privately. One of two things is going to happen. Either militaries are going to start working, and intelligence agencies and whatnot, on systems themselves, or quite likely, there's going to be contracts with kind of the big current labs where there's some, sort of separation, and it's not necessarily going to be completely obvious actually what the capabilities are in the public eye anymore. You think about things like there are significant parts of the budget for the intelligence agencies which are not even, they're not even just that basic kind of information is not not always public information, much less details of program. And so you wonder what's going to take place there, and in particular what capabilities will be developed.
I agree. I would actually expect that as models become more capable in the domain of coding, for example, some of the labs might, or some of the companies might be tempted to deploy these models internally in order to have them help on improving AI research further, so that they can perhaps get a further lead in the race. and that would be the maximally profitable or interesting thing from their perspective to do with the models, as opposed to deploying them broadly in society. That situation could become quite dangerous, because then you don't have this public information about AI models. You don't have this kind of back and forth, as we talked about, where institutions can adapt to the risks and so on.
That's actually something that I've changed my mind about a bit. Just a few years ago, I was not wild about open source models at all. And I think conditional on there being major private efforts, then I'm very in favor of there being comparable open source models. Even though they create a threat vector, they also create sort of a surface area of being able to say, oh, these are some threats that are being created. It also means that the organizations who are doing, computer security audits and who are doing all these kind of evals, it means that they don't have to, ideally they would be in a very adversarial relationship with the major labs, but in fact they need to work with them as partners. And so to some extent they don't really have quite the right relationship. But if they're using, Llama or one of the other open source models, they doesn't matter at all. A paper I really like, it's sort of a small paper, was Kevin Esvelt's group did this fine tuning of Llama to see how much it could help with creating pandemic agents. It's kind of telling that, it's just good to be able to use Llama in that kind of a way, and they don't need to get permission from OpenAI or Anthropic or whoever. That's the correct kind of that's the situation you want.
So it's a way to get information into the world about the current capabilities of models. And I think that's a good point. But
in particular, not just information, but you actually want to be able to do sort of the most adversarial things possible with things which maybe the labs might not be so keen on having discussed publicly. You can just sort of say, well, I don't care. And in particular, not having the organizations doing the evaluations need to be aligned with the companies creating them I think that's very healthy.
one thing that makes me nervous about open source is that you can't recall these models. So whenever you have an open source model released, you can never recall that product, no matter what it's capable of. And it's kind of proliferated into the world, as we as we've been talking about this, if it falls into the wrong hands, that could be a real problem.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's certainly a significant downside. It's interesting to think about the question, just how large are the models eventually going to be?
What do you mean, how large are the models eventually going to be?
It's very much sort of a stopgap intermediate kind of an argument I'm trying to make. If a model actually can only do inference, running on a significant cluster, if it can only, do those kinds of things, I think it's implausible as a long term, compute is going to continue to get cheaper. Yeah, maybe, sure, maybe it eventually turns out that you need whatever beyond a quadrillion, parameter model is, and so it's actually quite complicated to do this. But yeah, that's all. It's a massive reach to push back on your argument at all.
So far we can kind of depend on consumer hardware not being advanced enough to run frontier models, using a lot of inference, or reasoning models, thinking models using a lot of inference.
Right at the moment, yeah.
Yeah, but as you mentioned yourself, that's probably gonna change over time, unless we then find a way to most advanced models to require even more inference in a way that keeps up with computer hardware. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to enter into a world where you can run very advanced models on basically smartphones.
I think that's quite likely. I mean, the way in which that is, there's sort of an economic reason why that's going to fail to be true in its strongest sense, which is just, if you believe that more scale in the model helps, then you should expect whatever sort of the most powerful current chip is probably going to be required to run the best model. And so if that's costing $30,000 or whatever, that's it's going to have an advantage over a smartphone. I don't actually know whether or not it's true. It's probably not public information whether or not the current frontier models, when they're doing inference, are they simply running on a single chip? I'm actually just shamefully ignorant of that. I assume the answer is probably yes. And so they've got it deployed across a cluster, but you run your particular ChatGPT query, and it's essentially a single chip which is responsible for the output. I don't actually know whether that's the case, but that's sort of interesting. If so, it means that for a few sort of tens of thousands of dollars, you can do inference with the chip. Actually, I suppose, okay, so they are doing a lot of things in parallel. Okay, so I just don't. I'm thinking about the reasoning models. Okay, I take that back. Actually, there probably is, quite likely is something more expensive being done, which may not be so easy to do then on a. Okay, so it's a question of sort of long term what algorithms are done and how easily can they be sort of scaled up how easily can inference be scaled up beyond a single chip, and that's an interesting. I suppose that's an interesting economic constraint on your assertion about eventually the cell phone version not being so different from the frontier model. Good, great thought.
There are a bunch of open questions when we have a conversation like this, and some of them can be answered by some people in the world, but there are also generally open questions where no one has the answer. When we're thinking about AI risk or highly advanced AI in general, we are somewhat kind of fumbling in the dark without having an established science, and it feels like perhaps we don't have the time to have an established science, because that can take maybe decades, maybe a century. How do we act in that situation when when things are moving incredibly quickly and we don't it seems to me that we don't really have enough time to deeply understand the models that we're creating before before the models get very advanced.
No, well, I agree with all of that. I wish I had a magic, solution.
What I'm asking here is, like, how do we pragmatically approach that situation? I know you have you've been kind of involved in open science and so on, and something about how science works. How do we get a scientific grasp on this situation we're in?
Well, okay. First of all, I don't think it's primarily a scientific problem, unfortunately. To a very large extent, it involves everything. That's part of the problem, and it's also part of why I suppose I'm interested and excited excited, maybe the wrong term, encouraged at least to see people from so many different areas get involved. I think about people like Vitalik Buterin, actually, or a bunch of economists. They have different ways of thinking about how do you deal with the costs of externalities in the world. And so sort of seeing that kind of person, even, I think at first I rolled my eyes a bit. I would see, the Pope commenting, or the United Nations commenting, or, people, the representative from, whatever the ambassador from whatever country would make an announcement at the UN. And initially, I think I did the sort of the very arrogant physicist thing of sort of rolling my eyes and thinking, and that was just completely wrong. It's important that all those people are thinking about this and worrying about it. And I suppose I hope and believe that it's quite likely that solutions will come from very different and maybe unexpected directions. I think there's a kind of really interesting hubris in pessimism. To be pessimistic about something, you have to believe that you're so clever, you and your friends are so clever and so all-seeing that if there was a solution, you would know about it. And when I grew up, I was told things about that CFCs were going to kill us all, or excuse me, damage from the ozone layer was going to cause terrible, terrible problems, or that acid rain, or many, many other concerns. And in each case, what was going on was the people sort of diagnosing the problem, who were very pessimistic about it, didn't realize that always that like just how much cleverness was being brought to bear by people of goodwill, sometimes with very different backgrounds to themselves. So that I at least find encouraging. I also like the thought, people with very diverse expertise and very diverse interests working on it seems very important to me. It's why having the Pope comment is actually it's actually quite helpful. Sort of, if provided it's done thoughtfully and in an engaged way, because it does bring more people into the conversation, and in particular, it starts to bring more expertise into the conversation.
Do you think that over the long term, this problem is something that can be solved with governance mechanisms or cultural norms or so on? Can we have a world in which we haven't solved the foundational technical problems of how to say align or how to control AI systems, but then we have good enough governance that things somehow work out?
I mean, okay, so governance tends to get used in two separate ways in these kinds of conversations. One is just a very practical kind of a one. We have all these institutions that you can point to. So, the Hague, United Nations, the U.S. government, et cetera, the judiciary. Those are all governance institutions. And then it's also sometimes used in this vague way, which is how human beings control human actions and outcomes, generally speaking. And it's always the case that with difficult new technologies, we have to expand the former. The question is, how much do we need to expand? I think that there's a very large expansion necessary. It may be one that is essentially insoluble. One of the terrible things is that disasters are one of the main things that cause an expansion. You get the Union Carbide, or you get what's her name, Rachel Carson in Silent Spring. These kinds of things where they can point to a very large problem and it leads to improved governance mechanisms. It is very unfortunate. There's kind of this epistemic problem where if you can point to a very immediate, very legible threat, it is much easier to get an expansion in sort of the governance mechanisms we have available. Whereas if you're pointing to a relatively illegible threat, it's so difficult. I mean, that's, climate has been such a problem. It took 60 years really to make almost any progress at all on the climate models. And then many decades of wrangling and wrangling for this very long-term problem. So you don't get the same kind of immediate turnaround as to some extent you get with something like the threat from the ozone hole that we had, where people could just go and look, oh my goodness, there is this very rapidly expanding hole.
One thing that makes AI risk different from climate change is that the risks are going to be more apparent in people's lives. I think people are going to be able to interact with models that are impressively advanced, and that will make them that will convince them that there's something to this issue. Whereas climate change, you can, without without scientific grounding, but you can kind of look out your window and be a climate skeptic and think, okay, nothing is really happening here.
Yeah. I mean, even just the timescales, we don't notice, sort of changes over 20 years, and also just random luck.
One question I'm interested in is, over the course of history, you have a lot of people coming with doomsday scenarios, predictions of danger, right? And a good heuristic has been throughout history to be quite skeptical about this. Yeah, basically ignore them.
Y2K, great example.
Exactly, yeah. Or yeah, pick your doomsday scenario. When do we know whether that heuristic no longer applies, right?
Certainly, I mean, in this particular case, insofar as you can actually point to significant problems which are averted or dealt with, that's going to be very helpful. A problem with Y2K, of course, is that after the fact, it's very difficult to say, that there are still sort of two schools of thought. One says, oh, there was never really a problem. We spent goodness knows how much money and whatnot on a non-problem. And then there's another school of thought that will say, oh, we spent so much money and that's why nothing happened. I love examples like if you just look at the number of nuclear states, it's going up very rapidly. Then the Non-Proliferation Treaty comes into force, and it doesn't quite flatline, but you can see you can see the impact of the intervention there. It's certainly, I think, interesting and potentially a really good thing about some of the available organizations that they may be able to start to make legible certain impacts. That would be, very confidence inspiring. People do this in things like computer security, where there is just a certain amount of kind of public awareness. There's not enough by all accounts. Ransomware and whatnot is most of the damage there is hidden from public sight. So it's a little bit difficult to see the impact of institutions and tools. Hopefully, people will be able to make some of the impact of any interventions much more legible, simply as a way of, then being able to see what works and what doesn't work. I would love a sort of a nice compact example like that, the tailing off in the increase in the number of nuclear states. So we don't have, we might have had 100 or 150 now, and instead we've just had a small increase because of the nuclear cartel. I don't have a ready example to mind for AI. We're not in the situation quite yet.
One paradoxical situation you've pointed out is that if humanity reacts to a threat and thereby decreases the risk of that threat becoming a reality, well, then the skeptics will be able to say, okay, there was never a threat to begin with, right? This, of course, I would love for this to be the situation with AI risk, that we actually react, and then it's fine that the skeptics can say there was no risk here to begin with. But this is such a good example to point out how kind of difficult it is to navigate this terrain epistemically. We probably won't ever have a clear answer about how big was the risk at a certain time. We probably never will have a settled science here. So I've asked you this. I asked you this before, but what are the good heuristics here? What are the good kind of rules of thumb for navigating a situation like that?
I'm flattered that you think I might have something intelligent to say about that. I'm not sure. Well, I'm sure there are people who have more intelligent things to say than I do. I'm not sure anybody's solved it. Actually, I just want to lean a little. You asked me before, and you've sort of mentioned it again about this science of AI risk. And there's certainly, very clearly, there are some local things that can be said. There are particular threats and that we can reason about in a scientific manner. Thinking about it sort of more broadly, it is peculiarly difficult. I mentioned the example of climate before. There's this kind of just an astonishing fact that people started making arguments about climate change in the 19th century. And there was a kind of a famous debate between Angstrom and Arrhenius at the start of the 20th, I think, where they kind of came to opposite conclusions, both based on really quite plausible arguments and quite plausible physical experimentation. And from a policy point of view, it left us in a really strange situation. We kind of had a good argument that climate change might happen. We had a good argument that climate change would not. And it wasn't really until the 1950s or 1960s that, in fact, anything like a modern understanding started to develop. And then by the 1990s, it was really becoming the consensus and quite clear sort of what was going to happen. That's a period of, 80 odd years for what is fundamentally a very simple physical problem. And in the case of AI, it's so much harder because fundamentally you're talking about the structure of knowledge itself. you know, how are our systems going to change our ability to navigate that structure? It's a much, much deeper and much less accessible sort of part of the universe. I don't see. It's like that. There is no science of science in some sense. In sort of in the there are some. I mean, people. I have made contributions to the field known as the science of science, but it's not a predictive model of discovery. By definition, you don't have such a thing. You don't know what hasn't been discovered. That seems much, much harder to ever imagine having a sort of a detailed science of. It maybe seems a lot more like something like aircraft safety engineering, where at least you can have sort of reasonable models of the kinds of things that that can happen. I don't know. I mean, you're talking about changes in epistemics. Gosh, think about things like if you think about sort of a science of science, it's so hard to do because any tools that you would be using are actually themselves subject to change. You know, at some point, probability theory, was invented, and then people like Kolmogorov, really massively improved it. So if you had a predictive science of science, sort of back around whatever 1920 or so, 1930, when he was getting ready to do that, I think it was 1933, his famous paper. The tools that you would be using were actually intertwined with the tools which he was discovering, for people like Pearl and others with sort of the modern theory of causal inference. So there is this sort of funny intertwining. Our very epistemic tools are going to be changed. So I don't know. I don't know. That seems very, very, very hard.
Do you think that's a limit that we're reaching because we're human, or do you think that's more of a fundamental limit? I'm thinking of whether we could use AI to to understand AI, whether we could, in a hopeful scenario, dedicate a lot of, say, AI inference or AI thinking to trying to help us navigate or understand this terrain.
Sure, sure, sure. I mean, we actually, we do this kind of thing. So one estimate I've seen is that the US spends about $300 billion a year on fire safety. And so at some level, it's actually quite a similar sort of a situation. A lot of that is monitoring, trying to understand what are the threat factors, what kinds of technological modifications should we do locally to make things more fire safe and so on. And it's truly remarkable that the number is that large. And you can imagine sort of, dedicating a substantial fraction of all the world's AI resources to monitoring and attempting to understand and make legible what the other AIs are doing. It's kind of like a justice system, for AI.
The problem is it's difficult to know where to begin there, right? What is it exactly you have your overseeing AI system do? Because you're kind of trying to have the AI solve the problem for you, but before you can begin solving the problem, you need to kind of stake out the territory that the where the work is even done.
It just seems, so hard for sort of, for several separate reasons. One is just the possibility to do stuff sort of encrypted away from, where it becomes illegible to outside eyes. And the other is the intrinsic illegibility of intellectual work anyway. It can just be sort of very difficult to understand the implications of what is going on. So, you're monitoring your systems, and it may be very difficult to tell that something is actually something that has very negative implications. Really tricky problem. Great problem for a philosopher like yourself. If it was just intellectual, it'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, as a final topic here, I would love for us to talk about your recent essay on deep atheism and optimistic cosmism. These are two different worldviews or, yeah, approaches to seeing the world. How do they differ?
Oh, yeah. This was just so Joe Carl Smith wrote a great essay series, Otherness and Control in the Age of AGI, really just about how human beings think about the control of technology, the control of the universe in general, and how they relate to the universe. And deep atheism is Joe's term for having a very fundamental stance of distrust towards the universe. People often object, they hear this term, and they say, that's not atheism. It has nothing really to do with whether or not God exists, which I'm sympathetic to as an objection, but let's stick with the term anyway. Yeah, and I suppose I mean I read this essay of Joe's a year or so ago. I thought that was interesting, and then I was surprised by just how often the concept has come to mind ever since. And so I wanted to understand just a little bit more for myself what I think about this. I think in particular, I've been reading William James's. In fact, I've just finished just before this William James's wonderful book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And James does this really wonderful thing, which is instead of sort of asking the question, is this true or whatever, he just asks, what are individuals' religious and mystical experience? And in quite a non-judgmental way, he's just interested in kind of, essentially going and looking for accounts of, oh, this is what it's like to, go into a trance. Oh, this is what it's like to have a sudden conversion experience and so on in a very open way. He's not completely non-judgmental. He's not a credulous person, but he is a person who is quite open to just hearing a lot of different things. And I find that very beautiful. And I think of this idea of deep atheism as it's a particular version of that. Some people really believe that, as sort of a psychological stance, that the universe is kind of out to get them, while others are much more trusting. And it's interesting to try and understand what causes that orientation. I think it's related surprisingly much to your views on AI Express. Some things, like I said before, understanding things like the Great Oxygenation Event or the origin of nuclear weapons and whatnot probably changed my stance towards the universe to starting to think, oh, wow, there's like these enormously powerful things that are sometimes hidden in plain sight. And the only barrier is understanding. We learn a little bit more and we realize, oh, wow, we can change the world a lot, sometimes in really negative ways. So that's kind of a change in my own stance, which was caused by these, apparently quite innocuous types of understanding. But I'm very interested actually in the question. I happen to be in New York today, and I lived here for just a couple of months last year, and I was fascinated moving from neighborhood to neighborhood at the types of feeling in each neighborhood and the types of institutions which were available. In some sense, what you see walking down the street, particularly as a kid, yeah, that's kind of the set of actions which are available to you. Oh, I can go to the park. Oh, I can play on the swing. Well, that's only true if there are parks in your neighborhood. Otherwise, you don't internalize that. If you're a Stanford student, you internalize, oh, if I want to do something, I can raise venture capital and start a company. If you go to certain other high schools or universities, you're not going to have that experience. It's not a verb that's in your lexicon. So also sort of thinking about the way in which that kind of experience conditions people, like what sets their level of optimism, what sets their level of agency, what sets sort of to what extent do they feel a very win-win orientation versus something else, and what experiences in their past. It's not just experiences, there's genetics, there's environmental determinants, there's myths which condition it. And these are all, I suppose, sort of closely related to this orientation towards deep atheism, which I got interested in because of the to some extent just because of the connection to AI Express. It's very random set of connections.
These factors probably play a large role in what people end up believing about AI risk in the end. And we're not always as rational as we might hope that we were.
Actually, one of the things that I love in Joe Cosmis's essay is, he takes a sort of kind of his prototypical example in many ways is Eliezer Yudkowsky, who of course is one of the people who has done a great deal to develop and popularize these concerns. And he finds quite a few examples to suggest that Yudkowsky, like really, he does have this attitude of fundamental distrust towards the universe, which I thought, just is fascinating. It's a very concrete example of the connection that you mentioned. The psychologist Danny Kahneman, I heard him talk on a podcast once, and he said, in his opinion, like how optimistic or pessimistic a person is tends to be just a personality feature, which is not particularly rationally grounded, and there's not much you can do to change it, but it does determine an awful lot about what you believe about the world. And this is also clearly very closely connected.
At the same time, though, there is this, there is a reality out there that something is going to happen once we develop superhuman AI systems. In some sense, there might be a test of whether the world is friendly to us or whether the world is out to get us.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be quite a test. I don't know. I'm laughing better than crying. I must admit, I do find the Fermi paradox quite concerning in this context. Somebody else out there should have, if it was possible to navigate ASI, it should have been developed, and they should have colonized the stars, and we should see them everywhere. It worries me that that's not the case. That I think is part of the reason why I worry a lot about the vulnerable world hypothesis. The Fermi paradox seems like a considerable piece of evidence in favor of the vulnerable world hypothesis. I should say, by the way, actually, people sort of worry about being killed by ASI. I at some level, the alignment problem still persists, even for, if you had a society that was just AGIs, the problem in many ways for them would be even worse. They would have more power. They would have more capacity to wreak destruction. Unless you kind of get to this singleton situation where there's just sort of, essentially a single force running everything. We sometimes think of the alignment problem as being just sort of a problem for humanity, but it's actually a problem in general.
Yeah, I agree. Michael, thanks for chatting with me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Gus. This was really fun.